Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending this extraordinarily important side event for the fourth substantive session of the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Information and Communications Technologies happening this week. My name is Joey Holtzman, and I'm a youth activist and social media coordinator for Reverse the Trend, Save Our People, Save Our Planet, a youth initiative of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. I have designed and will be moderating this event. Our co-sponsors for this event are the Permanent Mission of Kiribati to the United Nations, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and Youth for Privacy, so we extend our thanks to them. Today, we will hear from 5 speakers who will be discussing the intersection between youth and information and communications technologies, abbreviated to ICTs, in the context of how states, organizations, the private sector, and other relevant stakeholders can better ensure equitable engagement and access of youth to ICTs. For those who may be unfamiliar, ICTs are defined by the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization as a diverse set of technological tools and resources used to transmit, store, create, share, or exchange information. ICTs encompass computers, the internet, live broadcasting technologies, recorded broadcasting technologies, and telephones, as well as all the physical and non-physical infrastructure needed to support them. More recent ICTs that you may be familiar with are smartphones, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. This Zoom call, in fact, is supported entirely by ICTs. There is not a single aspect of life today that is untouched by ICTs. Indeed, ICTs are transforming old employment sectors and creating new ones, expediting processes of globalization, and creating new and unique challenges to national and international security. States, organizations, companies, and all relevant stakeholders must realize that ICT literacy will be a prerequisite for survival as we plunge further into the cyber future, and that ensuring equitable engagement and access of youth to ICTs is a necessary and advantageous capacity building measure. Youth with access to technology are coming of age as cyber natives as the early adopters of ICT, myself included. Such youth are better positioned than their parents to harness the power of ICTs in new and imaginative ways. However, youth who do not have such access are at risk of being left behind in terms of education, employment, and positive life outcomes. In 2022, the estimated global number of unemployed youth was 73 million, a disproportionately higher number than their older counterparts. In addition, in 2020, the number of youth not in employment, education, or training rose to 23.3%, a level not seen in 15 years. Both of these statistics have no doubt been further impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Beyond the economic ramifications for states and financial ramifications for youth of these numbers, there are security implications. Indeed, the cybersecurity of states, organizations, the private sector, and other stakeholders will increasingly depend on youth who are ICT literate. So, how can ICT equity for youth be realized? The solution begins with uplifting the voices of young people on ICT issues, and the 5 speakers we have with us here today are here to do just that. Joining us from Cape Town, South Africa, is Anda Nakaba, a 27-year-old who serves as the co-director of the Algorand UCT Financial Innovation Hub at the University of Cape Town, where he manages and implements various blockchain projects. Next, we have 2 representatives from Youth for Privacy, a youth-led, youth-centered group seeking to raise awareness for digital privacy through education, outreach, research, and advocacy work. The first representative is Zeno Haro, an undergraduate independent cybersecurity researcher at Columbia University. Zeno also serves as the CEO of Unity, a high-fashion tech company. The second representative is Crystal Ann Briggs, a data analyst at Kenzie Academy, a coding bootcamp. From Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, where I also attend as an undergrad, we have 2 speakers. The first is Sarah Salim, who is a 3rd-year majoring in English and minoring in computer science. She is currently interning at the Nancy Yost Literary Agency in New York City. Secondly, we have Gabriel Dutra, a 4th year who is studying computer science and statistics. He is an international student from Brazil and a current intern at Canfield Scientific, a biotechnology company. I would like to extend my thanks and give my floor to my boss, Christian Siobanu, of RTP. Christian, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Joey, and apologies, because originally we were going to have Ambassador Sito of Kiribati deliver introductory remarks, but unfortunately he's experiencing some IT issues right now. Perhaps if I could be spotlighted, that would be really great. Great, so thank you all for joining us. And as Joey mentioned, it's with Reverse the Trend, Save Our People, Save Our Planet, which is a relatively new initiative. It was established in 2021, and it's really, focused on engaging with young people on both on issues related to international peace and security. And we've recently decided to really dive into cybersecurity and empower youth activists in this field. My co-founders and I created a digital educational modules online, which focus on nuclear disarmament, environmental justice. And now we're going to include also cyber as well, something that we're looking into. And in December, several of youth activists, including Joey Holzman and Anna Maria Belovich, delivered 2 interventions during the intercessional period. One looking on the need for the international community to engage with young people, and the other on international law. And we're very proud that our social media coordinator, Joey Holzman, is moderating today's event. Thank you so much. And the floor is back to you, Joey.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christian. So now we will move on to the guided question portion of this event. I'm going to pose 4 guiding questions and then call on each speaker to give remarks on each question. I ask that each speaker keep the remarks for each question to a maximum of 3 minutes. I also encourage speakers to bounce off the remarks of other speakers in their own remarks. And after this after 4 of these guiding questions, each will have about 15 minutes allocated to them, so it should take us to about an hour. We'll have a 15-minute question and answer segment at the end where audience members can post questions for the speakers in the Zoom chat. And so, yeah, on that note, let's get right into it. And the first guiding question is, how can youth access to ICTs be made more equitable? And we're going to start with Gabriel.
Thank you, Joey. Can you guys hear me well? Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be joining this event. And to answer this question, I'd like to point out the need to increase access to ICTs by promoting their usage in public schools, starting early in elemental and also middle schools, by introducing the young people to technology early on and teaching them how to properly use it. We can help bridge the digital divide and provide all students with skills and knowledge that they need to survive in the digital world. I have a personal example of this, which was back in Brazil. Private and middle schools, they started integrating ICTs through STEM classes. And you can see the difference that it made when those students started engaging through STEM careers. I didn't have this privilege during middle school, but I did have it in high school. And comparing my interest in the STEM fields with people who didn't have this, you could see how easy it was for me to enter the STEM fields just because of this previous experience. And I also want to point out the need to ensure that the knowledge of use of ICTs is also made equitable. And what I mean by this is that we can't just give the students access to ICTs, we also need to teach them how to properly use them. The use of ICTs should be integrated in academic assignments, and teachers should be able to instruct students how to properly use them. A couple of key examples of ICT's features that should be taught are the safety of use. Students should learn the basics of cybersecurity, like identify malicious content in websites and messages, how to identify trustworthiness of sources before downloading software, as well as the importance of keeping software up to date. And also the usage of new technologies. A great example of this is the new large language model, the ChatGPT, that everyone's using. I believe that technologies like this will continue to be developed and that the educational system should embrace them when teaching students instead of avoiding or trying to hide them. Since said software is likely to be extensively used in job markets, progressive schools who adopt them will give an edge to their students when they start seeking future employment. Those are my 2 main remarks about the question.
Excellent. Thank you, Gabriel. And you obviously come with a very unique perspective of having grown up in Brazil and then coming here and having ICTs shape your experiences abroad and in the United States. Do you think that in terms of integrating ICTs more so into the education side of things, especially like in elementary and pre-college, there's some room for, what room do you see for collaboration between governments and schools and like the education system and ways that they can work together to maybe integrate ICTs more into education?
I think the main idea will be to promote more funding through public schools so that students would have access to the ICTs. And then maybe a second one would be have more discussions on how ICTs should be integrated into assignments. It's really easy to integrate an ICT into maybe a STEM assignment, but you need more creativity to integrate them into other classes. So I think there's need to be a discussion on that and more planning on how to do it as well.
Excellent. Thank you for those remarks. Next, we will hear from Zeno.
Think, oh, did you switch the cameras? Yeah, okay. I think partially it is a school aspect, similar to Gabriel also. I studied in Mexico for most of my elementary school time. And there is this really big disparity between countries that I think we can't really ignore. And I do agree that maybe assignments could help, especially with non-STEM fields. But at the same time, we can't forget that at the start of the pandemic, a lot of students just had no access to internet. That's like even in the US, right? So I think ignoring this baseline of basic needs at this point with internet, I think we do have to go back to the schools, but also the communities and how they approach the internet and just emerging technologies. So for example, for me, as I was in school, in high school and middle school, part of the reason that I even got into the cybersecurity world was because my school blocked everything. We had a very limited set of websites that we could visit, and nobody wanted to talk about what was happening and why it was blocked, and we were never given a reason. So that's sort of how I got into cybersecurity, learning about new operating systems, how to break my school's firewall, like those kinds of things, right? And I think that that's something that can't be ignored by teachers and even parents, where a lot of the time they say, oh, this is dangerous, just don't do it, but they don't explain anything. And it comes down to education of the community and the teachers to just approach things not as in, don't do it, we'll give you no information about it, but just trust us, it's wrong. And that sense of education just integrated within the school system and after school activities could definitely help. I don't want to say we have to rely on after school activities or summer programs, which for me, that was the case. But maybe just say, hey, for your homework, let's now integrate this thing, which you think is happening already, but a lot of schools still, they don't let you use your phone. You have to, all your sources have to come from books. And I think that's just, the education system has been left very behind the times compared to where we are in reality and technology.
Absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree. And do you think that there's opportunity now for this to change, especially given the use of ICTs such as Zoom and distance learning that had to kind of be shunted into place during COVID, and perhaps internet access in areas that don't have that as like a baseline to provide to youth? Do you think that you see that changing now that we've gone through the COVID-19 pandemic?
I have seen more collaboration. There's more access to, like, if you're curious about something, you can attend many different things that before you wouldn't have had access to. So there is that improvement. So for us at Columbia, the first year that the pandemic happened, everybody was sort of panicking and everything was still very closed down. But I think as time progressed and as people got used to these technologies, access did definitely increase. I think we could see more of active and purposeful collaborations between schools and organizations, whether they be government or non-government, doesn't really matter. Even companies, like companies already host hackathons, right? So what's stopping them from just saying, hey, for this like session, as you're starting with your project on whatever, we're gonna have my former classmate who now works at Microsoft come and give a talk about something that's relevant, right? I think those things could happen, but there's still the something that stops this is, especially in public schools, private schools can kind of just do whatever they want, but public schools, a lot of the time there's, the school district and these other paperwork that prevents this from happening. And I'm not sure how to address that. Like, I don't work in the school system. I don't work in the public school system. But we have the ability of doing this even more. And I think it could be adopted. It's just up to how the processes get modified to adopt this into how the school system works.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for those remarks. Next, we will hear from Sarah.
Hi, thank you for having me. I so agree with what Gabriel and Zeno are saying about schools. I think that the difficulty with ICT in schools is that at this point, what is defined as progress is still so qualitative. I study English, so I remember growing up, there were graded levels of reading. So you could tell if you were learning something and if you were advancing, and you could also tell which areas in the country were not getting the attention they need. So I think that's a really important first step with ICT skills, just to sort of nail down the level of skill that is necessary to survive in our world and to create little building blocks towards that, so that we have a way to measure whether children are actually learning at an effective speed. And then we can track which areas are moving towards that goal as opposed to which are falling behind, in order to better help those that are falling behind. I also want to say, as an English major, that I see digital literacy as sort of just a reincarnation of the original literacy problem, being able to read and having access to books and being able to write. So I just want to point out that I think digital literacy is mostly the same, in that it requires access to the technologies in question and the time to practice with those technologies. And so a huge barrier has usually been class and money. And I think that we have an existing infrastructure, libraries, that have formerly addressed this issue with literacy because they provide free access to books and information, especially for those who can't afford it. And I think implementing ICTs and that technology into publicly owned libraries that are free to enter and free to use for the community is a great opportunity, not only to provide that technology and that exposure to the community, but also to revitalize libraries as a really important space for free access and free information. Libraries have already demonstrated children who participate in library reading programs and such also test higher in reading scores at school. So I'm willing to bet that if we allow libraries the funding and the technology necessary to hold programs for children in the area for free, the way we do with reading, we will see an increase, hopefully, in youth engagement and higher test scores with ICT usage.
Absolutely, really excellent points. I definitely agree, and I like your point about libraries and like having sort of a community ICT resource, and having maybe emphasizing that as an easier level of entry, rather than having full dispersal of ICTs. So like a library with computers perhaps, or a library with at least like internet connection that people can come to and can use collectively as a community. I guess and I also like your point about digital literacy kind of needs to start being seen as just literacy in general, in the same way that reading comprehension is. Do you think that how do you think that kind of convincing states that that is equally as important as, say, learning to read or do math? Do you think that's something that needs to be achieved through, like, do you think we need, how would you approach that if you were speaking to a president or a representative or something like that?
Well, it's difficult because I think we're all seeing just soon ICT usage will be just as essential to enter the job market as being able to read will be. I don't know what else you could do besides point that out, but I'm willing to bet that you know, students without access to ICTs, students without that experience, just like students who weren't literate, they're less likely to enter higher education. They're less likely to get a job post higher education, less likely to have a higher working salary, a sustainable career, etc. So I think this problem of digital illiteracy and inequity is already playing out. And the best way to point out that we need it is just to show how people without access to it are going to fall behind, especially in the job market and financially. So I think it's just sort of following the money in that sense and providing that as evidence.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean the connection between ICT and entrepreneurship, you know, providing flexibility in the value chains of employment, you know, allowing young people to compete for higher level jobs due to if they have access to ICT and are able to train using them is certainly an economic incentive for states and stakeholders. Next, we will hear from Anda.
Great, thanks everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. I guess, you know, from a South African perspective and as an African in the space, increasing the availability of affordable broadband is obviously something that's constantly spoken about, and we'll see the numbers of internet penetration increasing, but the affordability of broadband doesn't, right? Yeah, the affordability of broadband is still very expensive, and we can't even start to speak about it being equitable that people can't afford these access to the internet. So I think without us, if we aren't able to address that, then there's no way we'll be able to increase youth access to ICT. Secondly, I think it's imperative that we discuss the localization of technologies based on different places in the world, right? Like when we all speak about ICT, it's one big blanket term that's mostly been coined by developed countries. But if you take someone in South Africa whose first language isn't English and they're expected to now learn about technology and ICT in English, they'll never be able to compete. So I think it's very important for local entrepreneurs on the continent to then create local content and applications that are tailored to the culture and the environment. And language is a very important aspect of this. And this also then ties into the user experience. Most of the apps that we all use to relate with ICT were developed in the developed world by people who look very different to me or from different places than me. So I think that's also a key issue that needs to be addressed if we really want to make ICT access more equitable for youth.
Excellent. Yeah, really interesting. Do you think that issue, that disconnect between the more Western conception of ICT versus more local or regional conceptions of ICT and the barriers that come with engaging with ICT coming from certain localities and regions, how could that perhaps intersect with in terms of capacity building and in terms of you know, attracting foreign investment and attracting investment and capital to, you know, construct that infrastructure for ICT, for internet connection, for, you know, that sort of thing. Do you think that can be do you think that there's a path of reasoning for states that you can think of taking into account those regional differences?
Yeah, I guess on the African continent in particular, you know, Africa is not one monolithic structure, you know, and I always tell people this, and they'll try to think if you take an application built in South Africa to increase ICT access, it'll work in Nigeria. That's often not the case. So I think foreign direct investment also coming in needs to take this into consideration, that Africa's different countries are very different. And from an infrastructure perspective now, there is a lot of money coming in to fund fiber, etc. I guess now the onus is on foreign direct investors working with local entrepreneurs and SMEs on something so simple like laying fiber. You know, someone can become a fiber optic technician in 3 months. You know, you don't need a university degree to do that. That's an artisanal skill. So I think if we can place an emphasis on things like that and let people build their own infrastructure, that could work.
Absolutely. Yeah, and definitely, like, I think we sometimes overlook the hardware and the infrastructural aspect of ICT, and also the fact that, you know, with an ICT job, instead of university degrees with high investments of time and money, ICT, the sector itself places, and can place a greater emphasis on applied skills that young people can acquire through vocational training and accreditation versus alternative means. So we appreciate those comments very much. Next, we'll move on to Crystal.
Great.
Thank you. So jumping off of Sarah and Anda's point, I think it is important for, and I definitely agree that the access to technology is what's going to help the youth increase digital literacy skills. But on top of that, I think it's important to invest in our teachers. I think it's important for our teachers to have those digital literacy skills. According to stats, 1/3 of Americans actually lack digital literacy skills, which impedes their ability to get competitive jobs, because pretty much majority of jobs that exist today have some form of digitalization, whether that is tech or whether it's something else. Even in a field like accounting, you still need to have some form of digital literacy attached to that. So I think it's important to invest in our educators, because why? They're the ones who are in the front lines. They're the ones who are interacting with our youth, and they're the ones who should have those abilities to be able to educate them on digital literacy skills. But I understand that there are the lack of funding, specifically in certain schools that are more disadvantaged than others. Also, too, if you look at public versus private schools and what resources are available and what resources can be allocated. And it's important to get teachers involved, right? To have teachers collaborate with each other. Actually, there is a report in the TALIS that actually states that when teachers do collaborate, they're able to increase they create more digital literacy projects for students. And so there it shows there's evidence that when teachers collaborate together and when schools do support teachers, that it does create more impactful digital literacy improvement within the student population. So I think it's really important to invest in our teachers. Also to utilize government partnerships. So specifically in America, we had the Title IV with that pretty much focused on funding for schools that will increase, digital literacy, technology, things of that, and those types of supports for schools. And I think was really helpful. It continues to be helpful for the student population. So continuing that approach, I think, has been very helpful, and also on a global scale. I know it looks very different, but also too, I think it's important to invest in our teachers from a global standpoint as well. Specifically to see exactly what are the opinions of our teachers, right? Specifically when it comes to releasing, yes, thank you, new technology. A lot of the times principals don't even run those technological resources with their teachers, and they should, right? Because like I said before, teachers are on the front lines. They're the ones who are they're educating our youth, right? So like I said, it's important to invest in our teachers and to continue to do so as we move forward with increasing digital literacy skills.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I see a lot of similarities between what you just said and what Sarah's bringing up about, the importance of digital literacy and making sure that teachers are equipped to teach that digital literacy, and that becomes a requirement because it is necessary. So we're going to move on to the second question, which is, how can youth be better included in policy-making decisions regarding ICTs? And we'll circle back around to Gabriel.
All right, thank you. So when you think about policy making, you really think about, especially in ICTs, you're thinking about something that requires knowledge in multiple areas. And I think there's not a lot of opportunities for people who study multiple areas. Right now, if you're an undergrad in college, especially in computer science or STEM, the job market's really competitive. And it rewards people who specialize on very specific things. It doesn't reward branching off your knowledge into something else. So I think there should be more opportunities for students who are trying to double major or pursue different interests, especially when it comes to politics and computer science, or politics and some other STEM field. That way you can have people who are capable and more prepared to pursue a career in policymaking in those specific areas. And I think Crystal raised a really good point that our teachers should be equipped to and prepared to host classes that do interdisciplinary teaching, and also to integrate ICTs in schools and universities as well. And another point is that this debate of ICTs and policymaking should really start in high school for students to be able to have a better understanding of what the ICT encompasses and how they can maybe invest in a career on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree. And as a computer science student myself, you know, it is easy to kind of just go through, you know, the computer science track and, you know, not focus very much on the arts or social sciences or the humanities, and kind of it's very easy to get through without an interdisciplinary you know, view on such things, when, you know, the future of ICT as a field and as an employment sector, and as a way of life, is going to depend, you know, a lot on these policy decisions surrounding ICT. So I definitely agree that there needs to be more of an emphasis on this interdisciplinary nature. Next, we'll move on to Zena. Thank you, Gabriel.
Now I'm thinking about the interdisciplinary aspect of it, but there was research done by the Council of Europe where they found that there's two separate ways that youth get involved in the policymaking aspect, and some is considered innovative. Yeah.
Please mute yourself if you are not a speaker. Kindly, thank you.
So we would like to ask everyone to mute themselves if you're not a speaker. I'm so sorry. Please mute yourself.
Okay, I mean, they left anyway. Yeah, so there's two different ways. It's either the more innovative aspect, which is becoming more accepted, or there's a traditional route, which is the youth councils within an existing organization. But the things that are seen as more innovative are sort of the co-management of existing organizations, the co-production of events, which is kind of what we're doing right now. And then there's the digital participation, which is also what we're doing right now. But I think a lot of the responsibility is sort of laid out on the youth to put itself out there. So everybody says, well, if you're interested in this, why don't you just do it? And to an extent, there is some truth to it. But I do think we need to see more active input from older generations to include youth in the policymaking process. I feel like, and this is more of a feeling, right? That a lot of the times when you're trying to get involved in conversations that are seen as policy, it's serious. And then you come here and you're like, hey, well, I understand the tech. Can you teach me the policy? Sometimes it doesn't quite work out. So that's something that maybe it's, instead of putting so much pressure on the youth to start every initiative, you know, in terms of policymaking, maybe there could be more integration between existing organizations to co-sponsor, co-host, and even include youth as part of the management rather than just a separate council within a very large organization. And the odd thing is that this thing that was done by the Council of Europe did show that there's actually no difference between innovative and traditional approaches to policymaking for youth, because in both occasions, it all comes down to lack of funding and lack of understanding from the public. So those are the more overarching problems, that it's just funding is not really allocated that much. I mean, it varies by organization, but in general, it's the responsibility being placed on the youth to speak out for itself and to be included, where it's a space that doesn't include it by default.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree, and those are really interesting points. Yeah, having youth as part of the leadership versus a separate council is a really interesting idea. And I wonder if there's more room, more wiggle room for youth to convince, you know, all those older policymakers that we do that youth literacy and ICT is a capacity building, just because it is a capacity building measure, especially from an economic perspective. And if there is one thing that governments will listen to, it is listening to input that is economically advantageous, and youth can provide that. So I wonder if there is room there. But I appreciate your points about the a barrier of entry into policy and tech and the separation. So that's really interesting. Next, we'll move on. Thank you for those remarks, and we'll move on to.
Yeah, I think Zeno made a really excellent point, because I don't think anyone is better equipped than youth to identify the problems that are facing us as far as digital inequity. But at the same time, we need to be realistic about how much influence a young person really has over their environment at this age, and actual policy making. In high school, my computer science teacher was observant enough to realize that there were very few girls taking his computer science class. And he made the effort to pull us aside and just ask us, why we were in the class and why we felt there weren't more girls in the class. And he listened and understood that there is an intimidation factor. There's this sort of inertia that sets in. Once the room is mostly full of people who don't look like you, it becomes harder and harder to enter that room. And so he made a plan. He created a tech camp, which stands for Tech Education and Computer Science for Her. And he allowed the girls in his class that were willing, including myself, to come together and create an educational summer camp for middle school girls younger than ourselves, to get a head start on coding, so that that intimidation would sort of break down and they'd be more ready by the time they got to high school to take charge and enter those classrooms. And he gave us, we didn't lack resources. So I do want to add that, the problem of funding doesn't go away. We were only able to do this because we had the proper funding, but he also gave us say over the curriculum and how it was taught, and we taught the classes ourselves. And that was super empowering. And I think it's necessary to meet youth where they are, as opposed to expecting the youth to go up to the higher levels of power. And it's wonderful that we're speaking at a UN side event, but not everyone is going to have that opportunity. So if we want youth to start implementing policies, we have to allow them to implement those policies where they are first. And I think as we allow youth to actively address the problems that face us, especially by being involved with people younger than ourselves, that is it's a really good start.
Absolutely. Yeah, that point is it really should be on governments to meet youth where they are right now, just because we are so valuable, particularly in this conversation about ICTs. And it's a shame, and governments need to realize this. And especially, talking about the gender aspect of ICT, I'd like to remind this Zoom that young women are much worse off than young men in this field, exhibiting a much more lower employment to population ratio. In 2022, 27.4% of young women are globally projected to be in employment, period, compared to 40.3% of young men. This means that young men are almost 1.5 times more likely than young women to be employed. And this gender gap is largest in lower middle income countries at 17.3 percentage points, and smallest in high income countries at 2.3 percentage points. So there are certainly gaps, particularly regarding gender and diversity, that still need to be filled. But yeah, but it really should be on governments and states and stakeholders to come meet us where we are, because we are important. Like, we shouldn't, ideally we should not have to push as much as we do. Next, we'll hear from An.
Great, thank you. I think, firstly, policymakers need to understand that we're going through a shift from like a centralized model of making policies to a more multi-stakeholder model, particularly around ICTs and the internet. If you look at how internet governance currently works, it involves multiple actors, and it's adopted a polycentric model. And I feel like policymakers in particular tend to want to make policies in ICT in one department or one state, but I feel like ICT cuts across so many different verticals. And one way we could get youth more involved in this, ICT doesn't just sit with one minister or one, head of state, but rather it exists in all the different government departments that are supposed to serve people. Because lots of government institutions will have a youth department or a youth organization, but someone else is making policies around ICT when it actually impacts the youth a lot. So I think if they're all able to see that ICT enables what everyone is doing and it doesn't just belong in one box in a silo, then we'd be able to get youth more involved in the policy making.
Absolutely. I mean, ICT, as we all know here, ICT, there is not a single aspect of life that ICT does not touch. Like, it's impossible to put ICT in a box and try to set it off to the side and deal with it as a separate issue when it literally intersects with every single sector, with most aspects of daily life. And if not now, then it 100% will going into the future, because the future is cyber. So yeah, having not putting ICT, not saying, okay, here's ICT, putting it off to the side, and then, trying to address it as like this standalone thing is not, it's not going to be good. Thank you for those remarks, and we'll move on to Crystal.
Thank you. Yes, jumping off of Sarah's point, I definitely agree that we need to meet our youth where they're at, specifically when it comes to digital literacy. And specifically, I think it's important to look at, our local communities, investing in our local communities and seeing like what could be done for the youth based off of like what's around them. Like, for example, local public libraries, community centers, coding boot camps, tech competitions, hackathons, things of that persuasion. To give them the resources or give them the exposure that they could need in order to like technology. Also too, I think it's important from a global and more inclusive perspective to include youth voices that may not always look like, that are not always included. So for example, youth who might, youth with disabilities, youth who have diagnosis of HIV and AIDS, Indigenous youth. So, bringing their voices to the table as well is super important. What do they have to say? And including that too, because their perspective is unique in regards to how they interact with ICTs, especially youth who, those who have experienced poverty and discrimination, things of that persuasion. Also too, I believe that the United Nations International Youth Day, I think, was very impactful. Specifically around how they were able to bring together youth voices and have discussions with the youth on how to create concrete action plans on ICTs, and pretty much around creating a strategic plan on how we can, how they can incorporate youth perspectives in creating change in regards to, technology, but also from like global perspective too, not just from a national perspective. And I think that was a start to a strategic dialogue with youth. And I think we should definitely look at that. And for, initiatives like that, like those, look at them and expand upon them and see where we can improve upon those initiatives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Building upon what is already proven to be successful. And building upon those, investing in those opportunities for youth and investing in those initiatives for youth. Not saying that you shouldn't start like something from the ground up or like a grassroots type of initiative, but what works, and what works, don't try to fix it. And I think that's certainly informs the role of youth in ICT policymaking. Next, we will move on to our third guiding question, which is how can states and the private sector collaborate to encourage youth engagement with ICTs? And we'll start with Gabriel.
Thank you. So I think that states and the private sector, they should start by providing access to technology and training, and they should do this through initiatives to provide schools and community centers with the latest technology and ICTs, as well as programs to offer training in coding and digital literacy and any other technology-related skills. One idea would be to start joint mentorship programs where private sector and government can collaborate on mentorship programs where the youth are paired with experienced professionals in the area who can provide guidance and also knowledge on how to better engage with ICTs. And another important thing that I want to touch on is that states and private sector, they can collaborate to encourage youth engagement with ICTs by creating mentorship and internship programs, and especially to people that are not in STEM areas. We already have quite a few programs that encourage students who want to major in computer science or any other STEM area into making technology products or engaging to tech-related projects. but we don't have any programs that try to engage with people who are not in STEM areas or who don't have necessarily a knowledge or interest in ICTs or technology in general. And I think we should engage those people as well. A valid idea done by multiple organizations is that of hackathons, events where participants team up and utilize coding to promote solutions to multiple problems. Typically, though, these problems are tech related, and this always creates a bias in the event's engagement, as I said, because it's more likely to be attended only by people who are already familiar with ICTs and technology. And to address that, I think that the states and the private sector should promote hackathons and other events that focus on interdisciplinary questions as well, to have the engagement of people who are not STEM focused.
Absolutely, completely agree. And I mean that point about engaging youth who are in areas perhaps that do not have access to ICTs, because take like a tech internship, for example, that can be completed remotely. Well, there's no point in if the intern doesn't have internet access in their area, then they can't take part in it at all. So half of it is that infrastructure issue of making sure that there's the foundation to actually be connected, the ability to be connected to those opportunities to engage with ICTs. But it's also challenging because ICTs are necessary in a lot of those instances to train with ICTs. So it's definitely a challenging cycle. And maybe Anda has more thoughts on that and the regional effects and the regional situations for that specific issue. Thank you, Gabriel. Next.
Is it me or Sarah? Sorry, you muted before you finish your sentence.
Oh, next we will hear from Zeno. Sorry. Okay, I guess Christian is stepping out for a second, so we will move on to Sarah.
Okay, so I think for the most part, what Joey said was really true, in that it's amazing to create more opportunities, but if you don't have internet access, you don't have it. And I think public-private partnerships can be really useful for using the purchasing power of a private corporation and the reach of the US government to create that necessary infrastructure, bringing internet towers and such to especially rural areas, areas with low bandwidth, areas with weak internet access. That's the baseline. It's very hard to make progress if we can't work on that first. And the other thing, just from a US perspective, is that cybersecurity is becoming an increasingly crucial area, especially in ICT technologies. 1 in 3 homes in this country are infected with malicious software. On average, we lose about $350 and 20 hours a year dealing with cybercrime. So it's a problem that impacts the economy, and it's a problem that impacts our national security, which means it concerns both the government and the private sector. So I think cybersecurity is just sort of the natural intersection of those concerns, and it's a really good place to start. I think providing resources to get students in school more involved in cybersecurity specifically is really good, using creating government programs and creating internships and using incentives that are relevant to the youth that we're targeting. So for example, if you want someone to get involved in something and you know that the youth of that country are facing really harsh economic concerns, you want to offer them paid internships and paid programs, or you want to offer them a guaranteed track into a career or an internship. Those are the things that are important. And so for any public-private partnership to work, it has to acknowledge the needs of the youth and be willing to provide those as incentives. I will say that Nigeria has already been making a ton of progress with ICT equality and equity. However, they have, there's a report that was released by, the ISOR Journal of Humanities and Social Science, and they were talking about the obstacles facing ICT and equity. And they said that actually public-private partnerships can be a risk as well, because too often the private sector makes itself necessary to the survival of whatever program is created. And so when business concerns happen and the private sector has to pull their money or their leadership, the program collapses in on itself, and everyone that was enrolled basically starts where they began. So if we're going to actually, create these programs and these initiatives with an intersection of like private and government participation, we need to make sure that when they're created, there's a mechanism in place so that the communities and the schools that these programs and this money are brought to are able to survive and run it on their own once leadership and money from the original source is pulled out, so that we don't pour money and time into something that's ultimately not sustainable.
Awesome. Yes, I completely agree. The nature of a state-private relationship to build this infrastructure, to build these opportunities, has to be sustainable. I think I read the same study, Sarah. Yeah, when the money was pulled out, then everything collapsed. But these need to be sustainable opportunities and sustainable programs, sustainable initiatives, for it to bear any fruit. And it's quite literally, I mean, as you were talking about, it is quite literally a security issue for states. Like we are the future is cyber. We are, in the past 20 years, like we've all seen, how integrated internet is, how integrated, the web, computers, processors, how integrated that is into everything, into government, into companies, into the way that day-to-day processes run. So, having a population and having youth that are not ICT literate, particularly in cybersecurity, is literally a national security risk, and it's going to be very, very soon. So I think those are really good points. Absolutely. So next we will hear from Enda.
Great, thanks. Just also reiterate Sarah's point, with public-private partnerships, I feel like one of the biggest issues we face is either the state will want to do too much or private sector will want to overpower the state, but they both have the same objective at heart. So an organization that I serve on the board of called the Cortex Hub, an incubator accelerator based here in South Africa, is a public-private partnership, and we exist as an independent organization. So we get funding from both, but we've now spun it out and it's run by us as the board and the people involved, where we then raise funding to get operating costs, and we will get a few state subsidies. And I feel like that model's worked really well, to the extent that we were then invited by another state incubator that was focusing on the film space that had not developed at all. Then we took over that incubator as well and integrated it with our technology incubator accelerator. And by doing so, we were really able to show that the state can't do everything, and sometimes, given our private sector works, they can't either. So they need to come together and acknowledge that they have one shared objective, and then just try to build a team and an organization around that is very community-based. Because another issue that we saw is people would try and implement things in another province, or another state that are very different from where they're based. So sometimes you need local community buy-in, and that only works when you have them as the operating people, working every day, because at the end of the day, it's there to serve them. And that's really helped us as well from a safety perspective, because there's obviously crime is an issue, but because we get people from the community involved in the project and actual organization, they protect it more than anyone else.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. There has to be, we have to find that common incentive between in those public-private relationships. I think a lot of it can be an economic incentive, and a security incentive, as has been spoken prior, and absolutely the importance of, addressing those needs based on locality, based on region, and realizing that the needs in different areas will not be the same, and you can't implement the exact same thing in the same places. Thank you for those comments. And Zeno, are you ready to speak?
I had two separate ideas, and one is something that the government did, actually the IRS did, at my high school. So for my high school, I went to a very underfunded public high school with an English literacy rate in the region of about 30%. And taxes were something that people just didn't do. So what the IRS did is that they sent a representative to the high schools each year, where they taught students who were interested to file other people's taxes. And then that was something that us as seniors in high school were then able to teach and even start a club within the high school to teach people how to file taxes for the community. So that's a case where it's fairly successful because they just have this online course that gets updated every year. And then the club just presents it to the rising seniors each year. And that's pretty sustainable. It costs basically nothing, and it helps the community. So that's one case of that I can think that the government's already implementing good work in some communities. And then in the case of cyber and privacy, ICT specific things, I've seen really good work done with small business owners. There's a thing called the Center for Global Enterprise, which runs a thing called the Cyber Readiness Institute, where they'll teach a 2-hour course just on the basics of security for your business to entrepreneurs who barely registered their company, maybe, if even that, but they have no income, it's completely free, and you get the certificate and it has just the basics of what you need to know. So I think these outreach programs where you teach members within a community how to do something that then it's very easy to distribute to others for free, I think those are good initiatives. I think in the sense of, like, I think Gabriel mentioned hackathons earlier. I think those are very good to an extent, especially for people who already care about tech or care about art and VR or certain things. You know, they all have different themes. The only problem I see with that is that usually they're very short-lived, and it's like you have this weekend where everybody's hyper-focused, but then everybody forgets about that whatever happened in the next month. So I think these are good to call attention, but then pivot from these hackathon-like events to say, oh, you came to this, now let's do this like training that actually impacts your community. So one is attention grabbing and one is repetitive and sustainable.
Excellent points, absolutely. And then we will hear from Crystal lastly, and then I will try to keep your remarks a little short. We do have the permanent representative of Kiribati waiting in the waiting room who will give comments after you. But go ahead, Crystal.
Yeah, I'll be short and sweet. So essentially, going back to everyone's point, it's really important that we focus on, I think, job trainings for our youth. Specifically, there are about 20% of college students who lack digital literacy skills, which is very concerning, considering that these are our future, these college graduates in terms of like the workforce. And on top of that, like I mentioned before, 1/3 of Americans actually lack digital literacy skills. And from that, within the data, about 50% of African American and 57% of Hispanic Americans are within, are the ones who lack the digital literacy skills, which is very concerning. And so I think it's, and also too, Joey, you mentioned the gender disparities as well between men and women, that, women especially lack the advanced digital literacy or digital technological skills in order to advance them within their careers. At least that's what the data is saying. And so it's important to invest in our job trainings. Specifically, I think it's important to reauthorize the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act that was pretty much enacted by Congress in October, by Congress and ended in October 2020. And once again, going back to my point in revisiting policies, acts, etc., that have worked in the past and seeing where, where the challenges were, where the opportunities were, and then focusing on building from there and scaling upward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Excellent points. Fantastic. Well, thank you. So that is the end of the guiding questions. It is now my privilege, and I would like to extend my thanks and give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Tiburoro Tito, who is the permanent representative of Kiribati to the United Nations, and he's going to deliver some remarks. Ambassador Tito, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to interact with all of you. And I want to thank Joey and Christian and other co-sponsors for preparing this event. The mission of Kiribati is proud to support the voices of young people. We believe they contribute to the public-private partnership needed to foster a safe and secure environment. Often inside the United Nations, we, the member states, do not allocate enough time to engage with young people on critical issues related to peace and security. My delegation reminds me of the need to collaborate and uplift the voices of young people. Turning our attention to the cyber domain and ICTs, there are several initiatives at the United Nations, including the Women in International Security and the Cyberspace Fellowship. This fellowship supports the attendance at the open-ended working group and delivers negotiation training to women diplomats, diplomats from all regions in the United Nations cyber negotiations. Many Pacific diplomats have benefited from this program, and we appreciate that many female Pacific diplomats from the Pacific have been in the room. Yesterday, on International Women's Day, my Deputy Permanent Representative, Josephine Morte, delivered an important intervention on international humanitarian law. Regarding youth empowerment, member states may consider the creation of a youth program and encourage young people to engage and plan events with member states. Additionally, we need more than one session at the open-ended working group devoted to stakeholders in order to ensure that young people are ahead. On this note, I would like to give the floor to Christian and Sobanu of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and Reverse the Trend, who's also an advisor for the mission of Kiribati. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. On this note, I would like to conclude and thank everyone. I feel that perhaps final remarks should come from our esteemed and moderator, Joey Holzman, who did such a fantastic job. I'll give the floor to you, Joey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you, Ambassador Tito. So for the last about 15 minutes of this Zoom, we will open the Zoom chat for questions for the speakers. So please post any questions that you have for any of the speakers. It can be to a specific speaker, it can be to all the speakers, but please put them in the Zoom chat now.
So it doesn't look like we have a lot of questions. I think a question that we can ask, everyone in this group is whether it would be a good idea for state parties, or sorry, for member states to think about, or how we can encourage them to truly think about youth programs in cybersecurity, for instance. I know that's something that we've been talking about, together between our organizations. Last night it came up. And probably this afternoon as well. So I think perhaps maybe if one of you would like to talk about that, June, or if you would like to give as well. So.
Yes. So I think it's really important for, at least you said for youth. Can you repeat your question really quick?
Yeah, so it has to do with how we can engage and also encourage states to think about the creation of a youth cyber program, because there's one, as Ambassador Sito mentioned, for women, which has greatly benefited, helps female diplomats prepare for the negotiations. But how can we also inspire states to also support youth to a similar degree?
Definitely. So I think it's important for discussions like similar to this. Also, I think similar discussions where youth come together and have these discussions with member states. I also think advocacy groups like Youth for Privacy is also really important to recruit and gather youth voices and be able to instantiate discussions where youth could share their feelings, their opinions, strategic plans. I think is really important as well in these types of groups, as well as I think initializing forums, online forums. I don't mean like regular forums, like Google forums and things of that persuasion. Forums initialized by the government, or at least through private and public sectors, in addition to partnerships within certain companies, tech organizations that hire that have student programs, like for example who hire graduates from universities, because that's the youth. And considering the statistics on the lack of digital literacy skills for college graduates, I think it's important that we look at the data and we focus in on the groups that seem to have the lack of skills, at least in technology, but also from a cybersecurity standpoint. We have to look at also the data around, what the youth care about. Specifically, do they, studies have shown that college students do care about where their personal data is going in regards to, FOSSA or any information that they share with their universities, because they think that automatically it will be safe whatever data they share with the universities. However, there's reports showing that there's so many data breaches going on right now in universities, and up to recent too, like this year. And so it's important that we look at that data and we focus in on like what's going on. But like I said before, it's important to look at it from a bottom up approach as opposed to top down. And I think by bottom up, I mean have the youth come in and especially those who are marginalized and at least come from disadvantaged education in the sense of where they're coming from, and meet them where they're at, and basically see, okay, what do they think? Like, what are your opinions on, how we can make improvements in this area?
Thank you so much. Any other thoughts?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think addressing the youth should be seen by governments as a preventative measure, so that they don't have to hurriedly look for a cure later, 20 years down the line, where now there's breaches everywhere, and then they say, oh, why didn't we do something sooner? So now it's an annoyance, maybe, to governments, but you have to do it to prevent something worse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent question. I'm seeing one from the chat that I think is really interesting. It is a question for the group. Does the perception that all youth are digital natives obscure the fact that they want training? And I want Sarah to answer this first.
Yes, so I've heard this, like that term digital natives, very often, and it's definitely sort of really common perception in areas like my own, which well-funded school districts and close to urban areas and with good internet access. And in areas like mine, perhaps it's true, children get phones younger and younger. They are better at using tech younger and younger, but I believe it does obscure the fact that they need training, because there is a difference between being really good at using a smartphone versus understanding the technology behind the smartphone, versus being able to replicate that technology yourself and understand what it does. And I think what Crystal said earlier was a really good point, in that we sign up for all of these things as young people, and we give our information to so many different digital entities. And for the most part, where that goes is obscured. So I do think that too often the ability to use tech is overshadows the ability to understand tech, and those are two completely different things. And if we're going to be able to use tech to its full potential, we need to go further than, kids are really good at using iPads. We need to focus on their ability to learn code and their ability to understand the tech industry and all of these other highly important things that are going to impact them for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. Excellent points. Anyone else want to respond to that question? Okay, let's look.
I think
It
Joey,
is important to. Okay. Oh, say that again, Christian.
I think Joey, we have to be mindful of the time as well, because I know it's 2:30, and I feel like some of our presenters will be speaking in the afternoon.
Absolutely. All right. So in that case, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this event, and a huge, massive thank you to Anda, Zeno, Crystal, Sarah, and Gabriel for coming and speaking today. You've all undoubtedly proven the importance of equitable youth engagement and access to ICTs in this event today, and I'm so happy and proud of you guys. And we hope that this event and the knowledge that is garnered from it will help inform actions and discussions within the UN, all levels of government, organizations, the private sector, and other stakeholders. And a recording of this event will be available